So I'm delighted to be able to introduce David Rockhill, who's an associate partner at McKinsey & Company, who'll be able to talk to us about these other drivers and how our industry might respond. David, nice to see you.
Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everyone. And first and foremost, thank you, Richard, and the rest of the MBS team for the invitation to speak today. It's a real honour to share a platform with such a distinguished panel. So thank you very much for that. And I can't really imagine a more kind of compelling argument for change in the industry and disruption in the industry as that set out by Dame Judith Hackett just now. If we need a reason to change, again, I can't think of a more compelling argument than that. And look, I'm excited today to talk about this topic, the next normal in construction, about how we see disruption really shaping what is the biggest industry in the world, effectively. And I'm excited because although this conference is labeled the Digital Futures Conference, actually this disruption that I'm going to walk through now is happening right now. We see it happening in our organizations, with our people, across the industry right now. So this is real and it's happening now. So maybe a quick kind of introduction, first of all. Who are McKinsey and why am I here speaking to you about disruption in construction? Well, by way of introduction, we're a global consultancy. We work with some of the biggest companies and government organizations around the world around the topic of performance improvement through transformation. We spend a lot of time working in construction. I myself, a civil engineer by background, and we work a lot with the big construction companies, with engineers, with architects, investors, owners. So we see a lot of what's happening in the industry and we understand the challenges that clients are facing and the topics they're working on. And I guess finally, we spend a lot of time on research. And this is what I'm keen to talk about today. So the kind of big topic we've been looking at is, as I say, disruption in the construction industry. And we've been looking at that from a few angles. We've surveyed around 400 construction leaders globally to understand what change they see coming and what change they see happening right now in their industries. We've interviewed 30 CEOs from construction and architecture and engineering firms around the world. And we've analysed the financial data of several 100,000 organisations across the construction value chain, from everyone from developers through contractors through owner organisations, to really understand where value is currently created in the industry and how that might shift, who might win and who might lose as we start to see more disruption in the industry. So that's a bit how we come at this. So from that research, I mean, what did we find? So I guess if you only remember one thing or one set of figures from this presentation, it's that of the 400 people that we spoke to, 400 leaders across the construction industry, 90% believe the industry needs to change now, and that need is more acute than it was 5 years ago. And 80% believe the industry is going to look radically different in 10 to 20 years. Now, given the pace of change that we've seen in the construction industry over past years, that is pretty radical. I think the other thing to say here is that we ran this analysis and we ran these interviews before the big disruption of our time really hit, so before COVID. And so we actually then went out to the same group again back in May after COVID had become established and people were starting to see the implications. And the overwhelming conclusion was that the disruptions that we'd identified through the first piece of research were only being accelerated by COVID. So 2/3 of respondents felt that the COVID crisis would accelerate industry transformation. And 50% had actually already started increasing investments to adopt to this new normal, to adopt to this new way of working. So that's the overarching conclusions. I think maybe to take a step back, why does this matter? I probably hardly need to tell this audience why construction matters, but we are the biggest industry in the world, and we have huge underlying demand that's driving growth in the industry. So from a purely economic point of view, construction matters a lot. I think beyond the economics, and again, Dame Judith Hackett touched on these a few moments ago, but we have a huge social and political imperatives that can only be met by the construction industry. So we have a huge need to build new social housing and new affordable housing in the UK. We're a huge employer, so 7%, 1 in 14 of the UK workforce is in construction. So we have a obligation of really responsibility to provide jobs and provide employment. And we're facing challenging times ahead, right? So, I mean, if you look at the latest Bank of England forecasts, we see, the real implications of COVID are being worked through. We're starting to see, potential large unemployment. And again, as such a big employer in the industry, construction has a role to play in starting to stimulate that economic growth and stimulating that employment. I think another reason why construction really matters is climate change and addressing climate change. Again, we did some research on the impact of climate change on infrastructure a few months back. And what this chart shows is the proportion of time that different parts of the world spend in drought at the moment. So kind of white or light pink means that part of the world is hardly ever in drought, and the darker reds indicate where regions of the world are more frequently in drought. And so you can see here in North America, Europe, we're generally below 40% of the year spent in drought. If you then run the numbers and look at how this chart would look in 2050, based on current rates of CO2 production, the picture is quite stark. So if we look forward to 2050, we see that big parts of Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Southern Africa, actually will spend the vast majority of the year in drought, so upwards of 80% of the time. Why is this relevant, and why is this important to construction? Well, what it means a few things. So number one, it means that actually where people will want to live, if this change goes unmitigated, will change. So people will want to live in different areas. This means new infrastructure, new housing in new areas of the world, number one. Number two, we've got a responsibility to help the mitigation of this climate change. So whether it's through building more energy efficient houses, whether it's through shifting to low carbon energy generation, the things that we're going to be building are going to be different, and construction is going to support that. And I think the third reason why construction matters here is in terms of CO2 emissions. So we are a big emitter of CO2. 7% of global CO2 emissions come from the cement industry. So again, how are we going to play our part in reducing emissions? So again, a real imperative here for construction to play a role in delivering against some of these very real challenges that we have right in front of us. So how are we doing against this? Lots of challenges ahead, lots of things that construction needs to support from an economic, environmental, and social perspective. How are we set up to do that? Well, the stark answer is not very well if we look back in time. So if we look at productivity growth across industries and we compare construction to industries like retail and manufacturing, we see that productivity growth in construction has been pretty much flat over the last 50 years or so, whereas comparable industries have seen enormous improvements in productivity. Why does this matter? It matters because as an industry, as I mentioned on the previous points, we have a big workload ahead. We have lots to do. And as in any industry, there's limited investment. And so if we want to make sure we're delivering the outcomes that we need to be delivering to support society, to support the environment, to support the economy, within the investment constraints that we have, we need to be getting more productive. So there's a real imperative here as an industry to become more productive. I think it's useful then to kind of reflect a little bit on how did we get here. So why is the industry structured as it is? Why are productivity levels suffering? And what's it going to take to change that? So if we take it at its most fundamental level, looking at the market characteristics, we have customer demand that is cyclical by its nature. People aren't buying and building houses every day, or the same person isn't buying or building houses every day. We have the nature of the construction process itself. So it's a complex, logistically complex operation. It's done outside, it's done manually. And then we have the very local and very complex rules and regulations, necessarily so, which again drive the very kind of characteristics of the market. This creates certain industry dynamics. So it creates the project-based approach that we know and love. It creates a highly fragmented industry of many tens and hundreds of thousands of construction organizations just in the UK alone. It creates this culture of misaligned contractual structures and incentives, and it leads to a culture of or use of contractors and temporary staff. And all these factors taken together means that you have this cycle of limited ability to learn and reapply approaches. You have limited capacity for investment, which again leaves you limited capacity to drive innovation in the industry. And that leads to the impacts that we see on the right-hand side. So we've already spoken about the low productivity growth that we see in the industry, number one. We've seen a very slow pace of innovation and digitization. So construction is one of the least digitized industries out there. We see low profits and low investment from companies. I think this 4 to 5% EBIT margin is maybe generous when we look at the most players in the construction industry. And we know also that construction has some of the highest rates of insolvencies of all industries as well. So we have a structure that is creating instability in the very organizations who are meant to drive it forward. And then the final point here, low customer satisfaction. And this touches many dimensions, but the fact that we have so frequently cost overruns, quality issues, schedule delays on projects. Generally, procuring, specifying, buying, and completing a piece of infrastructure or a piece of real estate is a very unsatisfactory customer experience when you compare it to other industries. So again, a lot to do here. But this is just to explain a bit how we got where we got to. I think then the exciting thing is that we see two forces that are changing these market characteristics, that are forcing these market characteristics to change. And that's around the actual changes of the market characteristics themselves, but also external disruptions that we're seeing. So we'll take those two things in turn. So the first on the market characteristics are changing. So the nature of demand is changing, and I've touched on this a little bit already. We have a fundamental demand to deliver more housing in the UK, and this is actually a theme across developed economies in particular. So how do we deliver higher volumes of affordable housing? We see the need to shift towards low carbon economies, to shift towards different methods of power generation, to shift towards energy efficient housing. The things that we're building are changing. And then the final point here is on actually customer expectations are changing. And a bit, again, as Dame Judith touched on in her discussion a bit earlier, actually there's recognition that actually it's not acceptable to build to certain quality standards anymore. There's a recognition from whether it's house buyers, whether it's infrastructure owner operators, that quality standards need to improve. And so what customers and clients are asking for is changing. That's on the demand side. On the supply side, the number one issue that I hear when I speak to construction leaders and CEOs is shortage of skilled labor. It's the number one issue that they're concerned about. And we see this across developed markets. So whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the US, we see a shortage of skilled labor, which creates an imperative to improve productivity on site. This is only being exacerbated by COVID, where social distancing restrictions means that we're even more constrained in our access to skilled labor. And the third point I hardly need mention after the last discussion, but regulation is rightly becoming more complex and more stringent. And we have many, many implications for this. Not least the implications on people who are living in some of these houses that don't now meet fire safety regulations. And I think the other one I would say here, in addition to the safety regulations, is on CO2 reduction. So yes, we see the kind of public statements from major organizations in the industry about CO2 reduction. I think the second part of this is actually when we speak to investors, we see trends in investment changing. So whether it's through investments in coal assets, shifting to renewables, when you speak to the big investors globally, everyone is moving or trying to decide the best way to move from carbon intensive to less carbon intensive technologies and how to rebalance the portfolio. So it's not just something that's coming from the pure customer side, it's coming from the investor side as well. So combine the changes with the market characteristics with some of the exciting disruptions that we're now seeing to the industry. And this is across three areas. So we see new business models emerging, and we see consolidation happening in the industry. So whether you think about the rise of some of the software companies who are now big players in the construction industry, whether you think about companies like Co2, who are now driving new vertically integrated models in this industry, there are new types of construction organization that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago that are now emerging all over the place. The second point is around industrialization. So moving from a project-based industry to a product or production system-based industry. I think we're still going through the growing pains a little bit of modular, but it's hard to meet a developer or contractor who isn't now talking about modular. And the steps that we've made in quality, in the maturity of the supply chain to support modular have been pretty phenomenal in recent years, and that looks like it's only going to continue. And the third point is around digitalization. So again, the strides that the industry has made in what I like to call the kind of democratization of digitization, it's a bit of a mouthful, is pretty astonishing. So if I look back 5 or 10 years ago, when I was working as an engineer in the industry, yeah, BIM digital was very much an office activity. It was something that the designers worked on, and they kept their model to themselves, and that was that. If you look at the technology that's out there now, it's apps that can that are keeping operatives safe on site. It's punch lists that get pushed directly to people's mobile phones so they can start to see their activities for the day. It's real-time progress tracking using remote surveillance. It's really practical tools that people can pick up and use very easily and directly drive productivity on the construction site. So the richness that we have in digitization now compared to 5 years ago is pretty phenomenal. So you bring these external disruptions together with some of the changes in the market characteristics, and it creates quite an exciting opportunity. And maybe just to kind of illustrate the point about the external disruption and really bring this to life, this chart shows the level of external investment that's come into construction technology in the last 5 years versus the 5 years before that. And what it tells us is that the external investment into construction technology has doubled in the last 5 years compared to the 5 years before. This shows that external investors, people who have no affinity to the construction industry, recognize the pure value creation potential that construction technology is creating in the industry, and that should give us a lot of confidence. So what impact is this having? The combination of changing market dynamics and these external disruption is driving 9 trends that we see in the industry. Now, not every organization will be adopting these 9 steps. Some will be adopting very few, some more. But when we speak to construction leaders around the world, these are the topics that come up again and again, and these are the topics that they're bringing into their strategies. And maybe to pick out a few examples of these, I won't go through them exhaustively, but if you look at something like value chain control and integration, organizations recognize the fragmented nature of the industry. They recognize the waste that happens between steps, and they're trying to develop business models that bridge those steps. So if you take an example of Schneider Electric, for example, a big building equipment manufacturer, amongst other things, buying RIB software, a BIM software house. So again, trying to take control of that end-to-end thread of data that goes from the design phase through to the manufacture, through to the installation. A great example of value chain control and integration. We see more specialization. So we see a lot of organizations going deep on particular sectors rather than trying to spread themselves across multiple sectors where they may encounter greater risk. Good example of this is Bilfinger, the German contractor, previously in real estate, infrastructure, and industrial, now purely focusing on the industrial sector. And then I think that the final, maybe the third one to pick out here is customer centricity and branding. So we see particularly the real estate developers taking much more of a focus on customer centricity. I was speaking to the UK CEO of one developer quite recently. He said he wants them to be the first B2C real estate business. He wants them to, consumer brand, consumer product, really recognizing the importance of building a great customer experience when you're buying property. Now, if you take these changes together, we did some analysis where we looked at the overall construction value chain, so every step from development design right through construction, through handover and operation, and we looked at where the value is created in the different steps of the industry. And when we looked at some of these changes, we analysed those against the current distribution of value in the value chain. We came up with an estimate of between 40 to 45% of that value moving within the value chain. That accounts for about $265 billion globally. So what does that mean in practice? That means that there's a real opportunity for whether it's a contractor, whether it's a modular player, whether it's a software company, to start to capture new value across the value chain. Again, real disruption in the way the industry works end to end, which is creating big opportunities for different players in the value chain. So maybe to take a different view of this, when we were also speaking to our 400 survey participants, we asked them a few questions. So we asked them, which players in the construction industry do they expect to need to change their operating models or their ways of working most urgently? So which ones are going to be most affected most quickly by disruption? And the organizations that came out top were the general contractors, the developers, the design and engineering firms. So recognizing that new ways of designing, new ways of execution is creating a need for change with these players. And also, kind of more controversially, perhaps on the right-hand side, we asked the question: what type of player would you expect to see, the largest decline in the next 10 years or so? And again, general contractors, specialist contractors, also material distributors came out top, where you see where respondents expected to see the largest decline in those traditional business models. Again, just what we heard, but interesting to prompt some discussion. We then, as I mentioned, after the survey was done, we came back after COVID had kind of hit the industry, and asked where our respondents expected COVID to accelerate change in the industry. And a few messages came up very strongly. So they expected to see more construction players focusing on both value chain control and consolidation. And that's because people were expecting that organizations would be looking for scale and stability to start to be able to ward off and guard against some of these potential threats that would hit the industry time and again from as a result of COVID. The second spike that we saw was around investment in technology and facilities. So again, a big drive towards investing in digitalization and technology. And finally, on sustainability. So I think COVID has created a greater awareness in the industry on the need for environment and sustainability. So again, interesting reflections from the industry there. I think I'll wrap up, and I'll just close by making one remark, which is that this disruption can be daunting. The reality is that the challenges that we have as a society, as an economy, can only be met by the construction industry, and by the construction industry thinking a bit differently about the way things are done. This creates a huge opportunity for us. We have the talent, we have the technology, we've got the skills to be able to capitalize on this. Now's the time to decide how we do it. So thanks very much, everyone.